Hi and welcome to the Lightleaders, a podcast for lightworkers who want more money, power and impact. I'm your host, Alex E. Lember. I believe that we are currently in the middle of a global awakening of humanity and that leveraging entrepreneurship is the fastest way to raise the consciousness of our planet. So in this podcast, I interview lightworkers and conscious entrepreneurs who follow their soul mission and have built a business around it. I call them light leaders, and this is the new paradigm. You will hear their stories and, more importantly, receive tools, tips, and strategies on how you can also impact more people and grow your business while following your soul mission. If you hear little nuggets you love and you'd like to share, screenshot this episode and share on your Instagram stories. Make sure to tag us at the Light Leaders Podcast and we will repost. I have a question for you. How can we build a new Earth if we keep using the old systems? We can't, and this is why I'm such a fan of decentralized cryptocurrencies. I believe the old paradigm of centralized power and control is crumbling before our very eyes. The debt and money printing of governments is out of control. 35% of all US dollars in circulation today have been printed in the past 10 months. We are on the verge of a collapse of the old banking system and its currencies. I believe cryptocurrencies to be a safer store of value, an incredible investment opportunity, and a more fair system to build our societies upon. I am passionate about helping other conscious people learn why cryptocurrency is the way and how they can join the movement, learn more about how it works, and create their own secured and balanced portfolio. With my friend Fabrice that I've had in this podcast, we have created a crypto workshop for beginners. You will find more information on thelightleaders.org/crypto. Hi and welcome to this new episode of The Light Leaders. Today I'm with Tom Slater. Welcome, Tom. Tom is leading retreats around the world. You call them embodied freedom, and used to work with Avalon, right?
Yes.
So I did that retreat a month ago now. It was really profound, and I'm super happy to have you. So thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So Tom, before we start, I'd like to ask you, what are you grateful for today?
Today I'm grateful for just having eaten. I'm grateful for having a full stomach. Feels good. I'm really grateful for the life that I'm building here in Bali. A beautiful partner, and a beautiful relationship with the person that I work with, James, who's fantastic work partner and co-conspiratorial leader with me in the retreats. So I'm very, very grateful for that connection as well, that relationship.
So can you tell us a little bit more about, let's say, the work you're doing in general, and maybe what led you to it?
My whole life was leading up to the work, but the kind of skinny on how I got to do the work that I'm currently doing was basically meeting an amazing woman called Alanya Forsberg, who founded an organization called Avalon, and then I worked alongside her for a number of years, co-creating and evolving that work, which is basically coming in the format of 7-day retreats. And it's a lot of different things kind of plugged into one experience to an extent. So there's shadow work, there's inner child work, there's psychodrama, there's catharsis, a lot of trauma healing is done in the space. And then we're basically using surrender, presence, and connection as 3 very powerful tools for self-actualization and realization and truth, basically. So the work essentially is a very surrendered space in which we get to reveal our deeper truths, what's going on underneath the surface of our everyday homeostasis, everyday way we're showing up. Often we're positioning ourselves to an extent or a greater extent with other people, with ourselves. So the space is really an invitation for going into deeper and deeper layers of ourselves, and to really face different aspects of ourselves and to realize different perspectives, but in connection with other people. So it's a kind of opportunity for us to heal with and for each other.
Yeah, and so I did it a month ago and I totally got a lot out of it. I could feel parts of my power I wasn't owning, and through shouting and some catharsis, I could feel that I stepped up there. The moments when I didn't share my needs so much, so it's been a very profound experience for me, and I know a lot of people who have done it. Actually, that's why I joined, because a lot of people said really good things about this work. What makes it different than your usual personal growth retreat?
Well,
what do you specifically like about this work?
Yeah. Specifically like about this work is leaning into not knowing. So I'm facilitating the retreat along with James, but I'm very much coming from not knowing, as opposed to like I've got things figured out in myself. I'm a teacher, I'm a whatever, positioning myself in that respect. I'm very much on this journey too. So my invitation is very much also to myself to lean in connection with other people, and to draw from my experiences in life, but also through the work, having a lot of exposure to this work over the years, to draw from that to be able to kind of go into a curious landscape with people, but not to kind of hone anything to a certainty. I want to open to the possibility. So we want to close to some kind of certainty where we understand, oh, I get it, I understand what this is. And because we're working very somatically in the body, then often we have no idea what's going on at all, and we don't need to, but we can reach and grasp for cognition because it has that feeling of like, oh, I can kind of equate this to this particular story, but it's getting out of the story and getting into something, the landscape beyond story is so powerful. So it's working essentially with energies, working with what's alive in the body system as opposed to what's like understood in the mind. And that's what I love about this work.
And which is cool also, because if you do it a few times, then it's always very different.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say, oh, it's always a different retreat, but with yours, I can feel how that would be really much the case. And even 1 month after, I thought about doing it again.
Yeah.
And how did you come to there to be doing this?
Well, I mean, I've always been curious, and also like I've been on a kind of self-development exploration since I was very young, since I was about 8 years old. I learned to meditate when I was 5 or 6 years old through my uncle, and he was a Hindu, or is a Hindu. And so I kind of started out on that journey, and then I went a lot into uncertainty. I was very angry when I was a teenager. I created a lot of chaos with my father around this. And so it was a kind of mixture between being very uncertain and chaotic in my expression, and then wanting to figure it out and knowing that there was a deeper truth in me that I wanted to uncover, or a more compassionate heart that I wanted to realize. And so as soon as I could leave education, I did, and I went traveling, and I traveled for many, many years between the age of more or less 17 to up to mid-30s, periods of time when I wasn't, but a lot of the time I was, and I was seeking. I was going to a lot of meditation retreats, I was going into a lot of ashrams. I went to live with various different tribal cultures because I was looking, and I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I was just seeking and gleaning information, and unwittingly I was being taught along the way. So I was looking for a teacher to an extent, especially in my 20s. I wanted to be mentored somehow, and I never really found one. But what I realized was that life itself was my mentor, that actually just being open and constantly looking for novelty or looking for new experience, and the possibility in that was an immense teacher, essentially. So this in many ways informed, when I came to this work, informed my capacity to be able to lean in and to do this work. So for me, surrendering and being in a state of not knowing and being curious were just things that had naturally evolved in my own life. And then there was things which I wasn't used to around leadership, and so turning up as a leader and standing up as a leader. Also articulation, talking into a group was very, very hard for me. I had a lot of trauma around that because I thought I was going to be criticized or attacked, or I was going to be, exposed in some way. So that for me was a greater journey in respect of this work.
It's like a balance, right? Also, because I feel there's a lot of flow, there's a lot of, we don't know what's going to happen, which makes, for example, the retreat I attended very exciting. Interesting. Also, at some point, you feel like you're in a madhouse. And you let that happen. It's beautiful. But at the same time, we can feel there is still a container. There is still a flexible direction, but that there's a process of opening around a shared language, around the spiral dynamics that we can talk about.
Sure.
And then we go more into that flow and an integration. So it's not just flow. There's that balance.
Yeah.
That you hold as a leader.
Yes, completely. What I've learned over the years is obviously the kind of more defined the container is in a way, the more you kind of structure and take time to build the container, which is everybody. It's not just me announcing there's a container. It's everybody's truth coming into the space and then slowly kind of co-creating a sense of containment. The more you can go into chaos, the more you can go into uncertainty, the more you can go into unsafety, you can go into mistrust as well. So yeah, I'm hearing a lot of people pronouncing containers as being safe, for example, like this is a safe space. My personal sense of that is I would never pronounce the space as being safe. I would allow people to figure that out for themselves. Is it safe or not safe? So it's not like a doctrine or some kind of recipe to an extent. It's just that we kind of co-create the container, and every single time the container is different. So using certain frames and approaching very, very slowly as well is a really beautiful thing. The deeper we can approach in terms of establishing different frames, psychological frames and frameworks of understanding, the deeper we can go when it comes to a catharsis work or to any kind of embodied sense of what's happening. So yeah, I tend to go for cognition first and then slowly start to strip that away, really get people's awareness around how they're showing up in their lives and how they're positioning themselves and where they're at in terms of a psychological development. And I use a model called spiral dynamics, which is an extremely powerful tool. Basically, it's evolution of mind. So it's looking at from our baby state to our adult state. We don't just suddenly, it's not like this smooth journey. There are many different states of being between those two, and obviously there are people in various different states of awareness and consciousness, and with different interests and different understandings, and some people are more traditional, and some people are more innovative, and some people are more in a cultural sense more embedded in culture, and some people are more about counterculture. And so what's happening there, and it's a really amazing model for start to break that up, not really hard lines, but to start to look at the different components and then to get an understanding of where we are in our developmental model and then where we are in relation to our friends and our family. And so it really helps to get some discernment on that. Prior to learning that model, I just had this kind of, I think, which can be the case with some people, is you just have this kind of homogenized cluster of experience, and you don't really know why am I sometimes like this with these people, or why do I relate to this more than this, and you try and understand, but this is a very profound way of clearing that really quickly and directly. So I use that as a way for us to start to discern where we're at, where our trauma is also, where we potentially got shut down in power in our development, which is incredibly common in human development. and then how we can go back and meet those specific points in our life, which usually have age frames as well. So it's just a really useful tool.
Yeah, and do you want to share more about the different colors and the different stages, and how that relates to the work too? Because not only it's good for awareness, I felt it was really good for awareness for myself. What state am I in? Also, we create a share language so we can hold space for each other with more understanding.
Yeah. But
so there's these different colors.
Yeah, it's broken up into different colors, which makes it really simple to understand in terms of, and you can. It's very, I mean, if I share anything now, it's going to be very reductionist. But essentially, you're going from baby states, which is the color beige, which is essentially survival. It's complete dependency on one's caregivers. We don't really have a sense of self yet. We haven't developed an ego yet. We're basically in a very a state of profound need, and we rely heavily on other humans in order to survive. And that would be between the age of 0 and probably 1 to 2 years old. And then it goes to purple, which is about play, interaction, figuring the world out, exploration. It's more of in some ways it's more of a masculine energy, that we want to go out in the world and we want to taste. So children will literally taste everything. They'll stick things in their mouth, they'll bite the edge of tables, and they'll go around, and the adults will kind of follow them, like making sure they're safe, potentially. So that's purple in terms of the interior and exterior of our experience as well. Purple's very powerful, so it enables us to use our imagination in order to play. So children can project imaginatory circumstances onto everything. So you give them a pen, it becomes multiple different things, and it actually can become that thing. So it's super powerful with that. And it's at that point that our ability to create also comes online, and our ability to project also comes online. So as an adult, if we continue to have that capacity to project, then we can project into other people, and we can project into dead space in terms of our knowledge around, like, what we're seeing as opposed to what's actually happening. So we kind of get distorted at that point as well. So there's a kind of shadow side, and there's a gift side, and there's a kind of fully realized side to all of these different levels of development. So that's purple, and then from that emerges red, which is between the age of 3 to 6 years, more or less, which is when the child's ego arises. So they suddenly get a sense of themselves, an individual sense of self. So it's a first-person perspective. So it's I, me, mine, no, and boundaries are starting to form then. And these three early developmental stages are the stages in which we can get into problems around with our caregivers, our parents essentially, around power, around our capacity to play, our capacity to feel welcome, and to feel wanted in the world. These can be distorted at this point depending on how they interacted with us. So a good example of this would be red. When a child comes with red and they want to basically start defining themselves through boundaries, and to also anger can come at this point because it's just power. And if a parent feels that's oppositional, then they'll shut it down potentially, and they'll tell the child, don't be angry with me, never be angry. And if that's really taken in, then the child will shut down that energy as an expression, and will start to mediate the way they behave, because they won't get their needs met, they won't be loved, they won't feel accepted if they're angry. So then the tendency is to create personas, basically, like a nice boy or a nice girl, or seducer, like I'll just kind of be really sweet if it gets my needs met, and all that kind of stuff. So at that point we can kind of lose parts of ourselves, and we can essentially contract energies in our body, and then we can grow up with a very immature sense of our own power, which is very, very common in adults. So when you hear adults of any age arguing, often they'll sound like 6-year-olds or 7-year-olds. They have very limited articulation, and their ability to rationalize, to be objective, is very limited too. So when we get triggered around anger, often it will take us back to the point where that energy was shut down. So using this model and this work, we would go to the age where you founded that limitation in your body, and we'd work from that perspective. So work with your angry 6-year-old, releasing that energy enables it to be free to start catching you up to an extent. So you would suddenly start to mature that energy again. And I mean, can you imagine a world where that particular perspective got like equally matured over many, many years as opposed to being shut down? We would have very, very different ways of behaving now. We wouldn't have this sense that anger is unhealthy or unwanted or destructive. It would be a much, much more mature sense of that thing we call anger, but essentially it's just power. So people hold their power down in that, and it's held down by the next stage, which is blue. Blue is about family values, so family, religion, law, order. Within a family construct, it would be about rules. So if you're coming with red, for example, and you're biting your brother or whatever, and your parents would go, you cannot bite your brother, this is a boundary. That's very blue. So you're basically setting some kind of container for the child to, first of all, feel safe in, but also to understand that there are limitations to their expression. And that can be done in a very healthy way. Like children need a certain amount of routine and a certain amount of predictability. But if it's limited too much, then it can feel imprisoning and can feel extremely limiting and can feel constrictive and which then leads to the next stage, which is called orange, which is about innovation, rebellion, which would come more or less around puberty. So when we hit puberty, we tend to rebel against the laws and the rules of the house, and the way our parents do things becomes like the past. It becomes something we're not very interested in. We'll do something different, we'll do something better, we'll evolve things. And so we try and move beyond the limitations of our parents' boundaries and create a much more open way of interacting with the world, basically. So we move into a state of orange, which
orange quite individualistic.
Completely individualistic. Yeah, individualistic. In the business sense, it would be about making money, about like realizing a dream, like being an entrepreneur, looking at them in a very crass way, looking at the kind of profitable gains of how to operate in the world. How to make the most amount of money most efficiently with a good product, but how to minimize cost and things like that would be a very orange perspective. And there's a point within that you might start awakening to a deeper sense of a global value system, which would be realizing that employing people for $1 an hour in India or $1 a day in India even is possibly unethical. And that your business has a certain environmental impact and things like this. So this would start to move you into the next stage of development, not in just a business sense, but in a personal sense as well. That ultimately, when we go for those goals of like the incremental goals of materialistic possessions and things that can show our sense of self-worth or value in terms of money, are kind of empty to an extent. And some people never get beyond that. For them it feels great to have a big house and multiple cars and whatever they arrive at as a kind of a image of success. For other people it can feel super empty, and then it's like, well, what's beyond this? What happens beyond where I'm at? Because I'm still feeling actually lonely and kind of not very happy. Potentially I still have the same problems as I always had. This is not really solving anything. So then you move into the next stage, which is green, which is essentially a counterculture. It's more about community, it's more about alternative living, it's more a global sense of heart-centered sense of being. So then, in a business sense, you would probably alter your business to be much more sensitive to the nature of the world, be more responsive to people, be much more kind of open to compassionate and empathic way of dealing with things. Would be less about profit, would be much more about people. And then in a personal sense would be that you're much more living from the heart, that you really value the community and the community that really deeply relates to you, as opposed to just kind of your neighbours you hardly ever speak to, and the people that work for you. So that's essentially the kind of main spread of the colours in the spectrum.
And I would like to add just the next one, because then there's a few more colors.
Yeah,
I think one is really interesting is the yellow, and also you drew the parallel with organizations. I've talked in this podcast about teal organizations, which is in the book, Frederic Laloux, he replicates that work from Ken Wilber, but at the organizational level. So red would be like a mob, and blue is actually called amber, and it's a church, military. Orange would be pretty like a very capitalistic, let's say, business, corporate or entrepreneurs. Green, it's more a company that say they're family.
Ethical business and things along those lines.
And then you have teal, which in Ken Wilber is yellow, but it's the same. Yellow is on the individual level. I'd like to finish with this one for now, the spiral dynamics.
Sure. Yeah, there's a massive jump happens between green and yellow, because yellow essentially becomes self-aware. So in a business sense, in an individual sense, it's when somebody realizes the limitations of their perspective. So up until this point, every single color or layer of the spiral has a particular perspective, and it's limited. So if you're in a green perspective, you tend to look at orange as being, there are certain things that you can align to, like technology that you can use, but essentially ethically you wouldn't align to orange very much at all, because it's kind of destructive and it has a certain consequence that you don't feel is good. Again, orange would look at blue. Similarly, that blue has a certain functionality for orange business, for example, that you could use blue, but it's ultimately blue is following a very traditional path that is very limiting. So each perspective denies the perspective before, and therefore has a limited perspective itself. Yellow is very, very different, because you suddenly become dynamically self-aware to the point where you can see the value and the truth in every single layer previously. So that's when the spiral becomes a spiral dynamic, because you can start to move through each turn of the spiral very, very fluidly, and you can see that every single perspective has a grain of truth. You're much more interested in ideas over community, for example. So rather than being super embedded in a particular perspective and having people around you that validate your perspective, you're much more interested in challenging your own perspective and being curious about other people. Like, how did you come to, your ideologies? How did you come to your perspective in life, or whatever? So it's looking at it's looking at the different developmental stages much more fluidly and with less identification, essentially. So you're loosening off any kind of limited identification, and you're looking at systems. Your systems starting to what is called systems thinking. So you're looking at complex systems, not just complicated systems. So a complicated system is like a car. You can basically break down the components of a car and lay it out, and it's complicated. But a complex system is a very constantly evolving system that is interdependent, but also co-creative in terms of the different nodes kind of constantly responding to each other. And so nature in many ways is a complex system. It's almost impossible to understand, but we can, be curious in terms of our engagement with it. And so systems within systems, and in those systems you would hold paradoxes. So it's very difficult from limited perspectives to hold any kind of paradox, because the thing that is in paradox to your perspective would be essentially something that you would fundamentally disagree with or disown in terms of a value system. So this is really reclaiming unknown parts of ourselves as well, and empowering ourselves. It's not that you have to suddenly agree with everything, it's that actually owning certain parts of ourselves that we've attributed to things on the outside is really, really powerful. So looking at something as being destructive, there's a lot of destructive behavior in the world. Often owning our own capacity to destroy is a very powerful way of creating a different relational dynamic to destruction. Because we things that are easy for us to admit, like, oh, I'm a great person, and people say, oh, you're amazing and you're, you know, fantastic human being. That's super easy to admit. Yeah, it's super easy to receive that. But if people are critical and, you know, also if people are showing up in a way that you don't feel aligned to, then that's very, very difficult to admit in ourselves that we potentially have that capacity too. So a lot of this work using spiral dynamics as well is about reclaiming the parts of us that we've basically outsourced to other people and disempowered ourselves. So the more we can reclaim, the more we can feel empowered, and the more dynamically we can move in life, and we can meet people where they're at, as opposed to wanting them to meet us where we're at. So
it allows to really resonate with more people.
Yeah, and then we can dilate our compassion muscle and empathy and have a lot more dynamic experiences and hear lots of different perspectives and realize that there are multiple realities happening at once. And yeah, so it's a very powerful tool.
That really resonates with me. I mean, I don't know if it's so accurate. I'd identify more as yellow now that I know this. And I can see the evolution. I don't think I've spent a lot of time in blue, but I was very orange. I did a prestigious business school, and I quite liked the game of being an entrepreneur, or even in my startup, having great results and being successful in the criteria of the Western world, let's say. And then about 4 years ago, got a bit of a spiritual awakening, and then I could feel that I was like I had the truth, and I was quite preachy. I wanted everyone around me to start meditation. Oh, you have to start meditation. I bought 70 The Power of Now. And a lot of my friends and all my family, they got The Power of Now to read. I don't know if many of them actually read it. A few did. They liked it. I was like, so
you have to read it. It's the key.
Did you read it?
Yeah.
And I found that more recently, maybe in the past 2 years or so, it's been easier for me to relate, for example, with old friends or with family. Or if someone says something about me, I don't take it so personally. So I feel that, at least the way I understand it, I see that pattern of orange, green, and going beyond that.
Yeah.
So that's been very helpful for me, even though I could feel it, to have that, let's say, rational frame around to understand better.
Yeah. I mean, moving into like a yellow perspective also dilates one's experience in terms of receiving life too, that it's less filters. We're less biased around our own filters, around our own perspective, and so we can receive and admit more in terms of allowing life in, being literally penetrated by life, you know. And then in terms of our expression, then our expression can be way more dynamic too, because we just have this much broader sense of who we are. We get a kind of more centered sense of ourselves, and a more like healthy ego can start to kind of build itself or rebuild itself around, in our essence, who we are. So if we're not certain of who we are, then we tend to try and define it on the outside of ourselves. We'll go into relationships with people that will making up for lacks in ourselves, for example. I'm not very confident, or whatever the narrative is, and then we'll look for somebody who potentially is either not very confident too, or is confident enough for me to kind of rest in my unconfidence and to rely on them to be that kind of person. So the more I've realized in myself around being abundant in my being, then the less I'm looking for someone else to complete me, or whatever the narrative is around partnership or friendship or relationship in business or whatever it is. And so, yeah, it's a fantastic tool for that.
And as I see I've evolved, I even have people who eat meat interviewed in the Lightleaders.
Yeah.
Vegan would be a big one also, of green paradigm.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, vegan, having a strong spiritual practice, meditation or yoga or whatever it is.
No, you have to do Kundalini yoga.
You have to.
That's the one.
Exactly, yeah. The particular kind of yoga is really important. Yeah, exactly. Not just any kind of yoga.
Well, you can, but a year of Kundalini yoga would be about
Yeah.
10 years of other types of yoga.
There you go. Yeah. Plant medicine also is a massively powerful one as well, and this can be the transition between orange and green can be instigated in literally one plant medicine journey. So a lot of entrepreneurs or people will go and discover ayahuasca or whatever it is, and they'll go to Peru, or they'll do a ceremony, and suddenly they're like, their mind is blown, and they're like, shit, this is a completely different landscape, and they're shaken up to the extent where they have to start questioning everything, including themselves.
Yeah, for me, LSD was 4 years ago part of the, let's say, acceleration in the spiritual change.
Yeah. And then we can start, the problem then is that level of awareness and development can be very seductive, and we can start to, again, build an identity around it, and we find our tribe, we find our people, we find a new sense of family, and it's very, very seductive in terms of, I just want to be here with people that are in my agreement field, have the similar perspective, and then immediately we start to other. As soon as we say us, we create them. And so the othering thing can become a big problem, because we can put people into boxes, and it's very convenient for us to do so, and we're not really looking at anyone as an individual or as any kind of dynamic.
It's a tricky one, because, for example, here we're building community, and we have agreement fields because we feel I want to live with people who have certain values and share certain values. Doesn't mean necessarily that I don't want to talk or see other people that are outside that agreement field, but we're also community people. And I mean, for me, I don't know if that's a green thing, but it feels good to live with people who share my values for health, for sovereignty, for decentralization and freedom.
Yeah.
And I could live with people who don't share these values, but that's not my preference.
Yeah. And again, I think it's concentric rings. Like, one doesn't need to necessarily live with the people, but being open to other people's perspectives and to challenge one's own boundaries around that, and not to have these kind of hardwired boundaries where we're denying or we're holding things off. And I think in terms of community building, it's really, really valuable to challenge within the community. I mean, the ultimate community is one's relationship with oneself. If one doesn't have a really good, open, strong sense of oneself, then stepping into community, again, we can kind of outsource the decentralized sense of self into the community, and that can become unstable to an extent, especially if we're not going into interpersonal dynamics actually and challenging that within the community itself. So a lot of communities now are saying, we want to create something different, radically different. And so in my world, that starts with this and this. If one interpersonal connection can't be seen clearly or realized clearly, or without tools or ways of figuring through things in a really open, compassionate way, then as soon as you start to fractal that out, it becomes increasingly complicated, and then it becomes complex, and then it becomes very difficult to actually manage to a certain extent. As soon as it goes over specifically 150 people, for example, which is the Dunbar number, which is anything below 150, you can have a personal relationship with up to 150 people, and you don't really need a centralized hierarchical way of leadership. You can have a decentralized leadership. As soon as you go over 150, then certain dynamics start to build from there, and you start to lose a sense of personal connection. And so fundamentally for me, the personal side of the developmental model of, first of all, self-development, but also community development, comes with self-actualization and realization, and that comes with trauma work, shadow work, like the capacity to speak truth radically as well, and to challenge, but also hold compassionately too. So it's a kind of balance between those forces.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I do think we can go beyond not knowing people and have some decentralized way to still operate and trust and do things. But yeah, I mean, even in the community we have the community aspect of it and our values, but a lot of it is personal development and going towards self-actualization, and is around being all sensitive but honest and holding each other in our higher selves. You talk about a lot of it is about trauma healing. Do you question? I know the answer to. Do you feel there's a lot of traumas to heal on this planet?
Yeah, a lot.
And do you feel it's not done very well so far?
Well, there's many modalities of trauma healing, and I think there's some amazing trauma work being done for sure. And
but why is yours the best?
and I don't think mine is the best. It's just a way.
It's very, very yellow of you.
Yeah, so yellow. I think I'm using trauma in a very broad sense. Like some people will be way more specific. Some people use big T and small t trauma. So big T being something very impactful and profound that happened to somebody in childhood, or an accident, or some kind of very, very significant traumatic event. Little T is little incremental moments of neglect or lack of self-worth and things that build up over time. But I'm using essentially the notion of trauma very, very openly, broadly. So it's essentially anything that's unequalized in the body. So something that's existing inside one's interiority that doesn't necessarily match or meet the exterior landscape. So holding an energy or a perspective or a secret inside our mind or inside our body energetically or emotionally, and not having the confidence and feeling that it's unacceptable to express ourselves or to articulate what's happening, is a contraction essentially in my world. And so the less contractions possible, so that we can have this kind of homeostasis, openness that equalizes the pressure. Otherwise we have pressure building up on the inside of our body. And then we have, it can come out in fight trauma, it can come out flight trauma by running away from a situation. It can cause freeze in the body system. So we go into a contraction to the extent where our body starts to shut down and we get very limited, and we just essentially go into a kind of shutdown of our body and our mind. Our mind seizes up and we can't articulate or rationalize anything anymore. So the less we can have in terms of reacting to the world around us, the more we can be in an active adult state, where essentially we feel safe, because the opposite of trauma really is safety, because all trauma is a feeling of not feeling safe, either in one's own body or in relation to other people. So it's a very significant indicator of trauma is when we look around a room and no one feels safe, even our loved one, even our beloved, or someone we would consider a friend. If they doesn't feel safe, that's a really good indicator that something traumatic has been triggered in one's body system. So in my world, there's a need for operating adults that are in action and not in reaction, and functioning in a way where we can really start to evolve in many respects, the community and the culture and the spirituality and emotionally as well. We're fantastically amazing at manifesting materially. This is something we've mastered and will continue to master exponentially. From the agricultural to the industrial to the computer revolutions, it's just like but we haven't done the same in terms of our emotional evolution. Our emotional evolution has been kind of constant to an extent, and if we were to evolve at the same speed as we're doing materially, we would be in a very, very different place.
Yeah, and thank you, by the way, at the retreat. I remember one of the things that came to me is at some point I was getting back like a baby, and you held me for a really long time, and the part of me felt, is it okay? Is it going to need to do something else? And I could see the patterns of not being conscious, but not really asking what I need sometimes, or feeling it's not okay, or that I can't be supported. That was also to give an image of what happens during these retreats. Is like I went back to a younger age and feel that rewired a bit the story there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These really young ages are foundational and fundamental, and we can, at that kind of age, when we're so susceptible and we're so fresh in the world, we can easily be traumatized or we can be influenced by our environment in a profound way. So healing those foundational pieces of ourselves can be like life-changing, because
young, like when you're just born and we give you blinding lights of the hospital, take you from your mother.
Exactly. Yeah, completely.
And actually there's a lot of rebirth process, because birth in our society is probably it's made to be pretty traumatic.
Yeah, completely. It's the story around birth is it's painful and you need to push, and it has a certain trauma element. You go into a hospital, there's a clinical environment. We associate hospitals with ill health, for example, and everything is, like you said, bright lights and people with masks and goggles and gloves, and you get taken and washed and whatever, and then you get placed. Nowadays, you get placed directly on your mother, which is super important. But for years, they would take the baby away for up to 5 or 6 minutes before it was placed back on the mother. So it's not surprising that a lot of people, there's a fundamental feeling that one isn't welcome in the world, or one doesn't have a strong sense of place. And that can come from those very early developmental stages.
Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I mean, we could go on a lot on this, all of these topics. Yeah. But I want to really thank you for the work you're doing. And you've been doing with many people, with me, your dedication. I'd love to know a little bit more what's up for you now, if there's something you want to share with the people who listen, how they can follow you.
Sure. Well, at the moment I'm based in Bali, and for the next 2 months I'm taking some time out. I want to go to the mountains and I want to paint. I want to create in different ways and spend some time in nature. And then at the moment my retreats are based specifically here. The next one will be at the end of January. I've never really advertised ever for them. I don't have a social media presence. I don't really use Instagram or Facebook for that. I tend to socialize a little bit, but I'm not heavily present there. So it's all word of mouth, and invitation in some sense through someone else's experience. And that's always been the way that I've advertised. If there's any advertising, it's through other people's experience. So that's essentially how this thing moves. And so far it's worked that way. And I kind of like that to an extent. There'll be, my intention in the next year is to land consistent monthly retreats here for the next year or so.
Okay. Has anything changed? So you are going to leave?
Yeah, no, I'm not going to leave.
Okay.
Yeah, I decided to stay here for 3 months.
Amazing.
More. Yeah, I felt a lot of pressure and uncertainty around that. So I decided to stay, and when I decided to stay, my whole body relaxed, and I knew it was the right thing. So.
I did the same in July. I thought I'd go to Costa Rica and didn't.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy you're staying.
Thank you.
And
me too.
Do you have a last thing you want to share with the people who listen?
Well, it's been an honor to share this with you, and I can't really think of anything I want to share right now.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's just been a beautiful experience. Thank you so much for offering this to me, isn't it? I feel very honored to have had this time to share. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who listened.
Thank you for taking some of your precious time to listen to this podcast. If you stayed until the end, I assume it was insightful. So if you like this podcast, please share with friends. Remember that if you tag us in your Instagram story at the Lightleaders podcast, we will repost. Tell us what you've learned. You can also leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Now, if you want to stay posted about new podcast releases, especially as we get censored more and more on big tech platforms, make sure to join our newsletter and our Telegram. You'll find the links on thelightleaders.org. And feel free to contact me directly too, whether it's for feedback or potential collaborations. Thank you again, and let's co-create the conscious new earth together.